It's been a very full and rich day of discussions, and it would be impossible for me to summarize them, and I'm not even going to attempt to do that. I might pick out a few of the bigger themes that stood out to me today. It's going to be a personal interpretation, of course. We are actually, as Daniel ended by saying, we're really approaching a critical moment in the life of Europe. Every 5 years we go through this process of re-electing a parliament, appointing a new commission. And I don't think it was such a big deal until the one 5 years ago, or 4 years ago now, I should say, when we realized how much difference it can make. Partly the new parliament coming in, but especially a new commission. And I think President Juncker, with his approach of political discontinuity and actually taking political discontinuity to a new level, he has just shown how crucial the appointment of a new commission is. And so I think most of the public attention is understandably on the European Parliament elections, but close behind it we have the appointment of the new commission. And I think the discussions that we're having here and that are going on in many other conferences and halls in the lead up to this election are really key to shape not only the outcome of that election, but also what happens beyond and the priorities that will be set thereafter. Well, that was the kind of context for the panel discussion this morning, where, among other things, one of the points of discussion was what should be the priorities for a future 8th EAP. And I think in the light of what I just said, I don't think we can automatically take it for granted that there will be an 8th EAP. It would be, in a way, extraordinary if there wasn't. Yes, I did have the pleasure to attend the informal Environment Council 1 week ago today. And as Gunther Liebel said this morning, there was unanimous support from all the member states for an 8th EAP. But there was more than that. There was a real ambition from many of the environment ministers who spoke about the content of that 8th EAP, saying that it shouldn't just be addressing the classic environmental issues that the EU environmental policy has been addressing for decades, but should be looking at the issues of systemic change and the problems the way our economic system is creating problems. And I think it was very inspiring to hear that. Now, I think we shouldn't be under any illusions, environment ministers in that context are speaking in a looser way, and their governments will for sure not necessarily take such progressive stances once any negotiations begin. And it's one of the interesting things about the dynamics of the three institutions, the way at one moment in time, one of them is the good guy and the other's the bad guy, and then in a few months that can completely turn around. So the Commission, it was funny when Daniel Clerc walked in and the next two speakers started criticizing the Commission for its poor prioritization of sustainability. And indeed, I think these criticisms are valid, but it's also interesting that often the Commission puts a proposal on the table and the member states do nothing but weaken it thereafter. So we have to take it with a pinch of salt. But I think it was interesting that there is such a high level of support there for this, and it would be really, I think, shocking if the Commission doesn't take that message, the incoming Commission, and do it. It's worth commenting that the timing of an 8th EAP is very significantly different from the timing of the 7th EAP, because the 7th EAP was adopted after close to 10 years of the Barroso Commission, close to the end of Barroso II. So the Juncker Commission, in a way, inherited it and had to accept it, whether it liked it or not. Whereas now we have a different situation. The new Commission will have the power to decide whether or not to have one, and then what to put in the first draft. So that makes that whole decision, I would say, even more crucial. And I think it does raise questions about the Spitzenkandidaten system, which was a little bit discussed, but not very much discussed today, because there is a kind of an assumption that I think is not justified, that the Council taking account of the outcome of the European Parliament election means that it has to accept the candidacy of the preferred candidate of the biggest party in the Parliament. And I think that could sort of lock us into a sort of first past the post winner-takes-all system, which is not really, I would say, the European model. It's more the UK type of politics, and that's perhaps something to be concerned about. But, well, we had discussions today about optimism and pessimism. And it was noteworthy that the first panel, they had a very long list of the problems and a rather short list of the successes. But there were important successes mentioned: energy efficiency, single-use plastics, the nature directives, outcome of the refit, drinking water, industrial emissions directive. There was a rather low baseline from our government representative saying, the fact that we still have an environmental policy. I think Daniel Kerr has also added others with his list of the achievements, the SDGs, Paris Agreement, Circular Economy Action Plan, and so on. And I think with all of these successes, there is the kind of half glass full, half glass empty story. And when you talk about, yes, indeed, the EU did play a leading role in championing the SDGs in the global forum, which makes it all the more disappointing that more than 3 years after their adoption, we still don't have a clear plan for what will happen beyond 2020, and we will not get a plan from this Commission. We will get a reflection paper. So this is the half-empty side of the glass. The Paris Agreement, again, the EU really in this international stage really did play a crucial role, which again makes it disappointing that it's not stepping up to its responsibilities to aim even for a 2-degree world, which we now know is unacceptable, far less to a 1.5. So a lot more work to be done, and I could go through the list like this, but time doesn't permit that. I think it is important, however, to talk about successes in a different way. And I think we haven't necessarily been good enough at talking about the successes of the EU and the EU environmental policy. Why do I say that? Because it's in our DNA, in a way, to criticize. That's what civil society does, and we criticize in order to make the EU better. And we need to do that. We need to continue doing that. But of course, we face a paradox now as we come up to the elections. That actually, a lot of these, one of the undercurrents of this election, a bit like the last one, will be the Eurosceptics, those who really don't like Europe at all, want the EU to be weaker, and those who want it to be stronger and go on and do more. And I think most environmentalists are more on the side of wanting to do more simply for pragmatic reasons, if not for idealistic or ideological reasons. But they've seen how much Europe can deliver for the environment. And we haven't talked enough about that, I think, and we probably need to talk more about it in the right places, about what the EU has done for the environment, to encourage people to go out and vote more in the direction of pro-EU parties, not necessarily any pro-EU parties, but ones that deliver the things that are important to them, and the environment has been clearly shown to be that. I must say that one of the big surprises for me from the day in terms of new facts came from Andrej Andrusevic and was supported by Anna from the youth. I've always just assumed that young voters would be more green than old voters, a bit like in the whole Brexit thing. There was a very clear demographic profile that young people were anti-Brexit more than old people. And I was very surprised with that, so I've sort of had to rethink about that, because I thought one of the strategies for the elections would be trying to get the young vote out to help the environment. I mean, it's still a good thing, of course, to get the young vote out, but the idea that that won't necessarily help the environment, I think that was my most depressing takeaway for the day. I hope someone can cheer me up about that later. But then, of course, there was the long list of failures, especially our panel this morning. Every panel member agreed on the issue of implementation. Implementation. 5 times it was mentioned. And explanations being lack of funding, lack of political will. Not everyone would agree with what one panelist said, that this is really means that we have to focus on implementation rather than new legislation. I think many of us would say we still need new legislation in some areas, but certainly more emphasis on enforcement, on inspections, using digital tools and satellites. Infringements were mentioned. Access to justice was mentioned, but only briefly, and I think we probably need to give more attention to that, because that's where citizens and NGOs can play their role in provoking, triggering better implementation of law if we can sue those who violate the law. And I'm happy that Daniel has mentioned the Aarhus case, which we do hope will move forward, because that is really a stain on the reputation of the Commission, and we hope it will be sorted out. Other failures that were mentioned: EMAS, greening financial flows was mentioned. 20% of the current MFF meant to go on climate action, proposal for 25% of the new one. But what about the other 75%? I mean, and that was also raised, that it's not good enough just to say that, you know, a chunk of the budget is going to be spent in a green way, if the rest of it can be spent in a way that goes directly against that. So it was good to hear the calls for elimination of environmentally harmful subsidies. And then, of course, that took us straight into the issue of the CAP, the Common Agriculture Policy, which would be, of course, the topic for a whole other conference, but is certainly a huge issue when it comes to budget. It's a huge issue when it comes to biodiversity. And, well, then we had the topics that were discussed in further detail were mentioned by a panel this morning: chemicals, nature, climate, and then discussed in more detail in the breakout sessions. And because that was this afternoon, and because we're out of time, I'm not going to kind of try to do a summary of the summaries that we already had. But I will say that it was, I think it was very good to hear in relation to the biodiversity group, first of all, the possibility of a Paris moment under the Convention on Biological Diversity, setting the post-2020 biodiversity framework, a global deal for nature and people. I think that's really something we should work towards. I was happy to hear Daniel seeing that as a priority, and I hope those who are succeeding the the College of Commissioners will listen to him, his advice on that. And secondly, something rather more immediate, and perhaps before an EEB would come in, is the Water Framework Directive and the fitness check there. I think there's really, this is time sensitive, and it's something that we really now need to defend the Water Framework Directive, especially hearing, as we did, that it's under attack by some governments and vested economic interests who really want to weaken this law. In relation to chemicals, it's quite clear that the regulation hasn't kept up laws haven't kept up with the proliferation of chemicals. And it's really a shame that the Commission hasn't and probably will not deliver on the 7th EAP commitment to produce a non-toxic environment strategy that was supposed to be done in 2018, but it's now seems apparent that it will not be done in 2019 either. And I think this is unfortunate. I don't want to argue with Daniel's claims of the achievements of the Commission. I think he was quite fair, but I do want to say that a lot of the good things that happened were not driven from the top by the Juncker priorities. They almost happened despite the Juncker priorities, due to the very good work that was done by many people, including in DG Environment. So I think there was a lot achieved. There was a lot not achieved as well that needs to be achieved. But the Juncker priorities were a brake, if anything, on what could have been achieved, because they didn't drive from the top. And that's why we really have to hope for better outcome next time. And then, of course, from the climate change group, again, I mean, this is another example where there's so much more needs to be done, and every new piece of evidence just shows that ambition should not be measured in terms of, you know, what our efforts have been. It has to be measured against the science of where we need to be. And I do slightly balk at the references to European or EU leadership and to EU ambition. I really don't think it's appropriate to talk about ambition when we are actually heading for a future which gives our young people really no hope. And we really have to tighten the ambition. I don't say I have no hope, because I think we're going to do that. We are going to improve the ambition, but right now our governments are not there. And then we had this wonderful panel this afternoon with other stakeholders, and And as most of you were in the room, I'm going to say very little about that. But personally, I did really like the focus on jobs. And especially, I mean, in a previous century when some of you were hardly born, I mean, there used to be this idea that jobs and growth is kind of against the environment. But I mean, now people from this century normally sort of understand that isn't the way it works. And it was just great in this panel to hear, you know, how these things do go together. And I just wish everybody in the Berlaymont and other sort of capitals around Europe understood that new vision, even not so new, but and then I did want to say more about that. Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting discussion about sort of not so much where do we need to go, but how do we work together and how can different actors work together to achieve that. That's a discussion we're actually going to take forward tomorrow in a slightly different configuration as a step towards launching a process for the EEB to have a long-term strategy. And I think we really appreciate the input from other stakeholders that we've had today. For us, I hope it's also been useful for you, of course. Well, I should really close now. It's really been a great day. Great discussions, both to follow the analogy that Joni Nissen, our president, had this morning, both on and off the pitch. I hope it's been useful to all of you as well. I'd like to end by thanking, first of all, our donors, which include the European Commission and Bruxelles Environment. I'd like to thank our conference organising team, absolutely amazing team. I'm not going to try and name them all, but I do want to mention Abraham and Alessia and Giacomo, and apologise to the ones I'm not mentioning. So thank you for your work over months to prepare. I'd like to thank you, Claire, for your moderating, competent moderating throughout the day. I'd love to thank our speakers as well. We've had such excellent speakers. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the participants. So thank you very much.